Everyone said it was over. James Brown said nothing. He just walked into the studio. But to understand what happened inside that studio on a cold morning in 1991, you first have to understand what it took to break James Brown. Because breaking him, really breaking him, was not supposed to be possible. Not this man. Not the man who had clawed his way out of the red clay dirt of Barnwell, South Carolina, with nothing but a hunger so fierce it could power a whole generation of music. Not the man who had once slept in cars, shined shoes for coins, and picked cotton in fields that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Not the man who had turned poverty into a philosophy, and that philosophy into a sound that would rearrange the bones of popular music forever. And yet, by the late 1980s, James Brown was broken. Or, at least, the world had decided he was. The fall had been long and strange, the way falls from great heights always are. One minute you are standing at the summit and the wind is in your favor, and you can see everything from up there, the whole beautiful complicated map of your life, and then something shifts. Just slightly, just barely, and the descent begins. And for James Brown, it began the way most great descents do. Quietly, almost invisibly, in the small decisions and large silences that accumulate over time until they become something impossible to ignore. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the very beginning. Not the Barnwell dirt and the absent father and the aunt's brothel where young James Brown learned that the world had two faces, one for the daylight and one for the dark. Let us go back to the beginning of his kingdom. Because you need to understand what he had built before you can understand what it meant to lose it. By 1965, James Brown was the hardest working man in show business. That was not a nickname someone gave him. That was a fact, measured in miles traveled and shows performed and hotel rooms slept in and mornings woken up still wearing the sweat of the night before. He performed over 300 shows a year. 300. That is not a career. That is a religion. Every night he would take a stage somewhere in America, or in Europe, or in Africa, or in Asia, and he would give everything he had, and then somehow find something more to give, and give that too. He would fall to his knees. He would scream until the veins in his neck looked like rivers on a map. He would spin and split and drop and rise again, over and over. Each a man not so much performing as conducting a private war against the limits of the human body. His band, the famous Flames, and later the bands that followed, operated under conditions that would have seemed absurd if the results had not been so magnificent. James Brown fined his musicians for missed notes. He fined them for late entrances. He fined them for wrong tempos. He ran rehearsals that lasted 12, 14, 16 hours. He knew the name and role and function of every single instrument on that stage, and he expected every person playing every one of those instruments to be as obsessed with perfection as he was. Most of them were terrified of him. Some of them loved him. Nearly all of them, even decades later. You would say that playing in James Brown's band was the single most demanding and transformative experience of their musical lives. Because here is what James Brown understood about rhythm that almost nobody else did. Rhythm was not decoration. Rhythm was not the thing that happened underneath the melody while the melody did the real work. Rhythm was the foundation. Rhythm was the architecture. Rhythm was the message itself. When he told his musicians to land on the one, the downbeat, the first beat of the measure, he was not giving a musical instruction. He was making a philosophical declaration. He was saying, here is where we are. Here is the ground beneath our feet. Everything else can be improvised, can be questioned, can be argued about, but the one is where we land. The one is where we are alive. And this philosophy produced music that changed everything. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in 1965 announced that something had shifted in American music, that the rules were being rewritten by a man from South Carolina who had no formal training and no permission from anyone to do what he was doing. I Got You, in the same year, took joy and compressed it into something that could power a city. Cold Sweat, 2 years later, stripped everything down to the rhythm and the grunt and the space between the notes, and in doing so invented a vocabulary that every musician who came after would spend decades trying to learn. And then there was Say It Loud, in 1968, which was not just a song, but a declaration. It's a public assertion of dignity at a moment in American history when that dignity was being contested and denied and fought over in the streets of every city in the country. James Brown did not stay on the sidelines. James Brown walked into the fire. By the early 1970s, his influence had spread in every direction at once. Funk, hip-hop, soul, rhythm and blues, and even rock and roll all owed him debts they could never fully repay. His breakbeats, the drum patterns from his recordings, would eventually become the most sampled sounds in the history of recorded music. Producers in the Bronx in the late 1970s would discover that when you played a James Brown break on a turntable and looped it, something almost supernatural happened. The music seemed to breathe. It seemed alive. It seemed to want something from you. And that something was movement, was energy, was the refusal to stand still. But here is what you need to know about power. It does not last forever. And here is what you need to know about James Brown specifically. The very qualities that made him extraordinary. The perfectionism, the control, the refusal to compromise, the absolute conviction that he knew better than everyone around him. Those same qualities, in the wrong circumstances, became liabilities. The 1980s were not kind to James Brown. The music industry had changed, and it had changed in ways that left very little room for a man like him. Disco had come and gone. New wave was in. Synthesizers were everywhere. The organic, sweaty, human-made funk that James Brown had spent 20 years perfecting suddenly seemed, to the people who made decisions about what went on the radio and what appeared in record stores, like something from another era, like a museum piece, like something you respected without necessarily listening to anymore. His record sales declined. His chart position slipped. The hits that had once come so naturally, that had seemed to flow from him the way water flows from a spring, endlessly, inevitably, were not flowing anymore. And James Brown, who had never in his life accepted a door that was closed to him, who had always simply broken through or gone around or found some other way, began to feel something he had almost no experience feeling. He began to feel stuck. And then there were the personal troubles, which we will speak of carefully, because a man's darkness deserves to be treated with respect even when it cannot be excused. James Brown struggled with substances. He struggled with the kind of paranoia that descends on very powerful people who have spent decades believing, correctly, based on experience, that the world is trying to take from them what they have worked so hard to build. The walls he had built to protect himself began to wall him in. The suspicion that had once made him sharp made him erratic. The people around him, who had once been too afraid of his fury to tell him the truth, were either gone or had learned to tell him what he wanted to hear. In September of 1988, things collapsed publicly in a way that could not be contained or managed or spun. There was an incident in Augusta, Georgia, a confrontation that escalated, that involved a vehicle. That brought law enforcement into a situation where law enforcement was the last thing James Brown needed. He was arrested, he was charged, he was convicted, and on December 15th of 1988, James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, the hardest-working man in show business, the man who had invented a language that the whole world was still learning to speak. James Brown was sentenced to 6 years in a South Carolina state prison. 6 years. The number sat in the air like a stone. The music world absorbed the news and moved on, because the music world always moves on. There were new artists to celebrate, new sounds to discover, new faces to put on magazine covers. James Brown was not exactly forgotten. You cannot forget someone who is woven so deeply into the fabric of what you hear and feel and move to. But he was set aside. Filed under history. treated as someone who had happened rather than someone who was happening. Inside the Stevenson Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, James Brown did what James Brown had always done in the face of impossible circumstances. He endured, he worked, he did not collapse, he did not surrender. He had not survived Barnwell and the poverty and the hunger and the years of being told by a world that did not care about him that he was nothing. He had not survived all of that to fall apart inside a prison. He got up every morning. He exercised, he kept his mind moving. He thought about music constantly, the way a man stranded in the desert thinks about water. He had no instrument, no band, no stage, no audience. He had only the music inside his head, which turned out to be enough. In 1991, after serving approximately 2.5 years of his sentence, James Brown was released on parole. He walked out of that facility in February of 1991, a 67-year-old man. Older, quieter, different in ways that even he could not fully articulate. The world outside had not waited for him. The charts were different. The faces were different. The sound was different. Hip-hop had not merely arrived, it had conquered. And at the center of hip-hop's victory were the breakbeats and the drum patterns and the grunts and the rhythms of James Brown, which was both deeply satisfying and deeply strange, because the man who had made all of those sounds was standing here on a sidewalk outside a correctional institution in South Carolina, with nothing but a future that he had to build from scratch. They asked him what he was going to do. Reporters, fans, people who were curious in the way that people are curious about a man who has fallen from a great height and is now trying to stand up again. "What are you going to do, James?" He said he was going to make music. They nodded politely. Some of them believed him. Some of them felt privately that this was the thing a man says in a situation like this, the thing you are supposed to say, the thing that sounds right even when the reality is that too much has happened and too much time has passed and the world has moved on and there is no real way back to where you were. But James Brown was not trying to get back to where he was. He had never, in his entire life, been interested in going backward. He went into the studio. Not immediately. There were logistics to sort out, there was a life to reassemble. There were relationships to repair, and lawyers to speak with, and the 1,000 small bureaucratic humiliations that attend the process of a man being released from incarceration and trying to function in a world that has continued without him. But he went. He went because the music was still there, still running in him like a current, still organizing itself in his sleep and his waking moments and the spaces between thoughts. The sessions that followed were not easy. Nothing in James Brown's life had ever been easy, and this was not going to be the exception. He was older. His voice, that magnificent instrument of gravel and glory, had changed. Not disappeared, not diminished exactly, but changed, weathered in the way that all things are weathered by time and trial. The music industry in 1991 was not interested in James Brown the way the music industry in 1965 had been interested in James Brown. He did not have a major label deal. He did not have the machinery that had once surrounded him, the infrastructure of managers and promoters and radio pluggers who had made sure that what he made got heard. What he had was himself, his hands, his voice, his knowledge of music that was so deep and so fundamental that it had become indistinguishable from his knowledge of himself. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not stand on stages and make declarations. It does not need an audience to witness it. It is the courage of the person who sits down in a chair, or, in James Brown's case, steps up to a microphone. When every reasonable calculation suggests that the effort is pointless, that the world has already moved on, that the moment has passed, that the best course of action is to accept the new reality and find a dignified way to exist within it. James Brown did not accept the new reality. James Brown stepped up to the microphone. The engineer in that studio, a young man not old enough to have seen James Brown in his prime, not old enough to remember Cold Sweat, or Please Please Please, or the famous Flames at the Apollo, this engineer has spoken about what happened when James Brown began to sing. He has said in interviews over the years that he was not prepared for it, that he thought he knew what to expect. An older man, a diminished legend, and someone going through motions that the world was no longer paying close attention to. And then James Brown opened his mouth. The engineer said he felt the hair on his arms stand up. He said the control room seemed to change temperature. He said that something happened in that moment that he had never felt in all his years of working with recording artists, something that made the technical side of what he was doing feel suddenly irrelevant, like trying to talk about the wiring in the ceiling when a storm has come through the window. He said his eyes filled with tears and he was embarrassed about it and he tried to hide it, and then he stopped trying to hide it because it seemed dishonest to try to hide it in the presence of what he was hearing. What James Brown was doing in that studio was not a comeback. A comeback implies that you left, that you were gone, that you had surrendered the territory and were now trying to reclaim it. James Brown had never surrendered anything. He had been interrupted. He had been stopped temporarily by forces that were larger than him in that specific moment. But the music, that was never gone. The music had been inside him the entire time, running quietly in the dark of that prison cell, organizing itself, waiting. The recordings he made in the period following his release did not all find their way to the commercial mainstream, and that is perhaps less important than it might seem. What mattered, what has always mattered in the story of James Brown, was the act itself, the returning to the work, the refusal to define himself by what had happened to him rather than by what he was capable of doing. The decision, made fresh every morning, to get up and go back to the music. Because here's the thing about James Brown that is easy to miss if you're only paying attention to the chart positions and the sales figures and the cultural metrics. He was not primarily a commercial artist. He was a man who had found, somewhere in the crucible of his improbable and painful life, a way of expressing something that most people feel but cannot say. Something about perseverance, something about dignity, something about the refusal to be defined by the worst things that have happened to you, something about the one, that downbeat, that ground, that place where you land and where you are alive. He would perform for another decade and a half after his release. He would take stages around the world and remind audiences who had forgotten or never known what it looked like when a man gave everything he had. He would play festivals and concert halls and television shows. He would collaborate with younger artists who had grown up on his samples, who had built careers on the foundation he had laid, and who would stand next to him on stage with expressions of almost religious awe. He would show them what it looked like to perform without reservation, without protection, without the carefully managed distance that keeps most performers safe from their own vulnerability. He was not safe. He had never been safe. Safety was for people who had something to lose, and James Brown had lost everything, multiple times, in multiple ways, and had learned that losing everything was not the end. It was just the place where you found out what you were actually made of. What he was made of was music, was rhythm, was the absolute conviction that the one was where you landed, and that you kept landing there, kept finding your way back to that ground, no matter what happened, no matter how many times the world tried to knock you sideways or convince you that the ground was gone. There is a photograph that was taken of James Brown backstage at a concert sometime in the mid-1990s. He is older in it, and you can see the years on his face, not as damage exactly, but as information. His eyes are very clear. He is sitting alone in a dressing room, and he is not looking at the camera. He's looking at something just out of frame, something that the photographer could not quite capture, something that was visible only to him. And his expression is not what you might expect from a man who has been through what he had been through. It is not resigned, it is not bitter, it is not even exactly peaceful. It is focused. It is the expression of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and exactly why he is doing it, and has never, for a single moment, considered doing anything else. He died on Christmas Day, 2006 in Atlanta, Georgia. He was 73 years old. He had been performing right up until the final weeks of his life, because James Brown performing was not James Brown choosing to continue when he could have stopped. James Brown performing was James Brown being entirely himself. It was the most natural thing in the world for him. It was the only thing he had ever really known how to do. Oh, and he had turned that knowing into something that will outlast every record label and every chart position and every moment of darkness that tried to define him. They played his music at his funeral. Of course they did. They played it in Augusta and in Harlem and in every city where people had ever stopped what they were doing, because they heard something coming from a speaker or a radio or a passing car that made them feel something they had not expected to feel. They played it in studios and rehearsal rooms and on turntables where producers were still, 30 and 40 years later, digging into his catalog looking for that perfect break, that perfect moment where the rhythm does something that no one can quite explain but everyone recognizes. He made the music that survived him. He survived everything that tried to stop the music. In the end, it is almost impossible to say where James Brown ended and the music began, because the line was never really there. He was the music. The music was him. Prison could hold his body for a time, but it could not hold his rhythm. The world could turn its back on him, could file him under history, could move on to newer sounds and newer faces, and none of that mattered, because the music was still running inside him, quiet and constant and inevitable, like a heartbeat, like a one. Like a one you always come back to, because that is what James Brown taught us in the end. Not just with his records or his performances, but with his life, with the whole complicated and glorious and painful arc of his 73 years on this earth. He taught us that the one is always there, that no matter how far you drift, no matter how lost you become, no matter how many times the world convinces you that you have gone too far and fallen too hard to find your way back, the one is always there. You just have to be willing to go back to it. James Brown was always willing. James Brown was never anything other than willing. And that is why, when he walked out of that prison in the winter of 1991 and went back into the studio and opened his mouth and started to sing, that is why the engineer started to cry. Because he was hearing something that had no business being as alive as it was, something that had survived what survival should not have been possible, something that had been pressed down into the dark and had come back up, like a root pushing through stone, like a note finding its way through silence, like a man landing, finally, inevitably, miraculously, on the one.